Close your eyes and listen. Not to the wind, not to the distant hum of traffic, not even to the sound of your own breathing. I want you to imagine absolute silence, heavy, unending. A silence so thick it feels like pressure against your ears, like weight. Now imagine that silence breaking, a sharp, mechanical thud, a remote-controlled steel door slammed shut. That sound marks the end of your life as a free human being. You are standing inside a room 7 feet wide and 12 feet long. Roughly the size of a standard parking space. Everything you touch is cold. The bed is not a frame with springs. It is poured, reinforced concrete. The desk is not furniture. It is a block of concrete extending from the wall. The stool is a concrete pillar. Even the walls are different. Not brick, not mortar. They are thick, high-strength stone, engineered to vibrate if you try to make sound. There are no bars here. Bars are for prisons where you can still see a hallway, where you might catch a glimpse of a guard walking past. Here, there are only solid steel doors. The only opening is a narrow horizontal slot, just wide enough for a plastic tray. Food slides in, metal closes, silence returns. This is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum. ADX Florence. Some call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. To the federal government, it is the terminal point of the justice system. It is the place where the world ends for the people we call monsters. ADX Florence sits in the high desert of Fremont County, Colorado. It was built for one purpose: total, absolute, permanent constraint. When you are sent here, you are not just being imprisoned, you are being erased. You spend 23 hours a day inside that 7 by 12-foot box. When your single hour of exercise comes, you are not taken to a yard. There is no grass, no basketball hoop. You are shackled, hands cuffed, feet chained. You are led to what inmates call the empty swimming pool. A concrete pit, walls so high you cannot see the horizon. You look up and the only thing visible is a sliver of sky, seen through a 4-inch wide slit of glass. No mountains, no trees, no view of the prison itself. This is intentional. The windows are angled so you can never map your location. You never know if you are on the north side or the south side. You never know where the perimeter fence is. You exist inside a physical and psychological black hole. So who earns a place in this concrete coffin? The men who turned neighborhoods into hunting grounds. The men who took sons and daughters from their beds. The men who used masks and cameras to broadcast terror across the globe. The great kidnappers, predators whose crimes were so extreme, so explosive, that the government decided they could never be allowed to speak freely to another human being again. Today, on Crime Cortex, we are going deep into the belly of this beast. We are examining the forensic breakthroughs that finally unmasked the shadows. We are following the digital footprints and biometric markers that led investigators to the most dangerous doors in the world. And we are going to see what happens when the most violent men on Earth are met with a silence that never ends. Before we descend into the history of these men, take a moment with me. We talk about some of the darkest corners of the world here, and it's important to remember the light outside. Tell me where you're watching from. What time is it there? What does the weather look like outside your window? Take a moment and look at the sky. Because for the men we are talking about today, that view is a luxury they gave up long ago. If you've been with Crime Cortex for a while, you know our commitment. The truth, no matter how unsettling. If you value deep forensic storytelling like this, hit the subscribe button and join the community. Your support is what allows us to keep digging where others are afraid to look. This is the story of the architecture of absolute constraint. This is the story of the great kidnappers and the high-tech hunt that placed them behind 4 inches of glass. The environment of the supermax and stepping into the blistering heat and absolute lawlessness of northern Syria. In the city of Raqqa, the self-proclaimed capital of the Islamic State, a shadow was beginning to fall over the Western journalists and aid workers who had traveled there to document the suffering of the Syrian people. Among the thousands of foreign fighters who flocked to the region, there was a specific cell that stood out. They were not just soldiers, they were jailers. They oversaw a vast and brutal network of at least 9 different detention facilities across Syria. But they were known for something other than their rank. They were known for their voices. In a land where Arabic and local dialects were the norm, these men spoke with distinct, polished British accents. The 26 Western hostages they held from 12 different countries began to refer to them as the Beatles. It was a nickname born of necessity, a way for the captives to identify their tormentors without knowing their names. There was John, the tall and calm leader. There was Paul, George, and Ringo. Yet, the whimsical moniker was a mask for a level of sadism that the world would soon see in the most horrific detail. These men were the architects of a regime of terror that included waterboarding, mock executions, and a psychological cruelty that left scars far deeper than any physical wound. The world first learned the true nature of this cell in August 2014. A video was released titled, "A Message to America." It showed a man dressed in black, his face completely covered, standing over American journalist James Foley. The man spoke with a London accent, delivering a manifesto of hate before committing an act of violence that stopped the heart of the tour. World. James Foley was the first. He would be followed by Stephen Sotloff, Peter Kassig, and the aid worker Kayla Muller. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was not a crime scene in a quiet American suburb. This was an active war zone. The Beatles were ghosts. They always wore masks. They never used their real names. They operated in a The legal battle to bring them to a United States courtroom was the next hurdle. It was a diplomatic chess match that lasted years. The United Kingdom had revoked the citizenship of both men, making them stateless. Yet the British government could not legally share the critical intelligence needed for a prosecution if there was a possibility they would face the death penalty. It was only after the United States Department of Justice provided official assurances in August 18 that the death penalty would be taken off the table that the floodgates of evidence finally opened. The trial of Elsheikh in 2022 was a moment of public unmasking. For the first time, the survivors were the ones who held the power. 35 witnesses took the stand, including former hostages like Danish photographer Daniel Rai Ottersen. Otterson's testimony provided a pattern interrupt that shocked the courtroom. He spoke about the silence of captivity. He explained that when Elsheikh and the others were... These emails proved that Elsheikh's involvement continued even after Kayla had been separated from the other hostages and moved to a different facility. The evidence was overwhelming. On April 14, 2022, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 8 counts. Elsheikh was sentenced to 8 concurrent life terms without the possibility of parole. His co-conspirator, Alexanda Kotey, had already pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. Today, these men reside in the H unit of ADX Florence. They are subject to special administrative measures, meaning their ability to communicate with the outside world is virtually zero. The men who once used the internet to spread their message of terror are now locked in a concrete box where the only thing they can see is the sky through a 4-inch wide slit of glass. The transition from the lawless deserts of Syria to the absolute silence of Colorado is the ultimate statement of the American justice system. It is a warning that no matter where you hide, your fingerprints and your digital footprints will eventually lead you to a concrete door. We are about to shift our focus from these international threats to a plot that was brewing right here on American soil, a plan to snatch and grab a sitting governor. But before we do, I want to check in with you again. I asked you about the weather and the time in the first section. But as we move into the darker half of this story, let me know, what is the most explosive true crime investigation you have ever followed in your own state? Is there a case that still haunts the local news where you live? If you are finding this deep dive into the forensics of terror compelling, please take a moment to like the video. It tells the algorithm that this kind of detailed, verified storytelling matters. And if you have not already, join the Crime Cortex community by hitting that subscribe button. We are just getting started. Next, we are going inside a basement in Michigan to find out how a second American Revolution was stopped before the first bomb could ever detonate. The stolen life of Elizabeth Smart in the early morning hours of June 5, 2002, the silence of the Federal Heights neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah, was shattered by a crime that seemed to defy the logic of modern security. Inside a scenic high-end home, a 14-year-old girl named Elizabeth Smart was taken from her bedroom at knife point. What made this case so haunting was not just the age of the victim, but the presence of a witness. Elizabeth's 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine, was in the same room. She watched from her bed, pretending to be asleep, as a man in light-colored clothing and a golf hat led her sister away. She heard the man's voice, a calm, quiet, almost polite tone that felt familiar, yet she could not place it. When Elizabeth stubbed her toe on a chair and whispered, "Ouch," the man replied, "You better be quiet and I won't hurt you." The investigation that began at 4 in the morning was a masterclass in frustration. In an era where we expect every crime scene to be littered with digital and biological clues, the smart home was a forensic desert. Despite the intruder cutting a window screen with a knife and moving through the house, the police were unable to find any usable fingerprints or DNA. They brought in bloodhounds, hoping to track the scent through the neighborhood, but the dogs found nothing. For months, the Salt Lake City police focused their energy on a man named Richard Raqqa. He was a handyman who had worked for the family and had a lengthy criminal record involving drug abuse. It was a logical choice for an investigation with no physical evidence, but it was a dead end. Raqqa died of a brain hemorrhage in August 2002 while in custody for an unrelated parole violation, never having been charged in Elizabeth's abduction. With his death, the investigation seemed to lose its only pulse, but the monster in this story was not a career criminal like Raqqa. He was a man who hid behind a self-made religious mask. His name was Brian David Mitchell, though he called himself Emmanuel. He was a homeless street preacher who believed he had received a divine revelation to take multiple wives. He had worked for the Smart family for exactly 1 day, raking leaves and repairing the roof, months before the kidnapping. While the city searched for a kidnapper, Elizabeth was being held just miles away in a camp in the woods, shackled to a tree with a metal cable around her leg. She was forced into white, full-length robes and veils, a tactic Mitchell used to hide her in plain sight. This leads us to one of the most significant systemic failures in the history of American law enforcement. In August 2002, 2 months after the abduction, a detective actually confronted Mitchell, his wife Wanda Bazi, and a third person in robes at the Salt Lake City Public Library. Because Mitchell used religious arguments about the necessity of veils and modesty, the detective was deterred. He did not force the group to reveal their faces. Elizabeth was right there, standing inches from a police officer, but the system's hesitation to challenge a religious persona allowed her captivity to continue for another 7 months. The breakthrough finally came in October 2002, not from a lab, but from the memory of a child. Mary Catherine had what she described as an epiphany. She realized the kidnapper's voice was the same one she had heard when the handyman, Emmanuel, worked on their house. A sketch was drawn based on the family's description. It was featured on America's Most Wanted on February 15, 2003. Within 24 hours, Mitchell's own family identified him to the authorities. The hunt ended on March 12, 2003, in Sandy, Utah, just 18 miles from the Smart home. Elizabeth was found alive, walking in broad daylight with her captors. Brian David Mitchell was eventually convicted of interstate kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor for sex. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Now, we must look at the reality of Mitchell's life in the year 2026. For many years, Mitchell was housed at the high-security United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. However, the architecture of constraint is not always enough to protect high-profile predators from the internal justice of the prison yard. In late May 2005, Mitchell was the victim of a brutal assault in the Terre Haute West Yard. He was found by guards bleeding from the head. He was moved to the special confinement unit for his own protection, but reports indicate he was attacked again, possibly by a cellmate. At 72 years old and small in stature, Mitchell had become a target for other inmates who viewed his crimes against a child as unforgivable. The system finally decided that Mitchell could no longer be safely managed at Terre Haute, El Chapo, and the backyard shed. When we discuss the occupants of ADX Florence, we are often talking about the neutralization of a persona. In the world of international organized crime, few personas were as large or as dangerous as that of Joaquin Guzman Lora. Known across the globe as El Chapo, he was the billionaire head of the Sinaloa cartel, a man who controlled a vast empire of narcotics, money laundering, and violence. Before he arrived in Colorado, Guzman was known as the Houdini. He had escaped from Mexican maximum security prisons, not once, but twice. His first escape in 2001 involved a laundry cart. His second, in 2015, was even more explosive. He disappeared through a mile-long tunnel equipped with a motorcycle on rails, which led directly from his shower stall to a nearby construction site. When Guzman was extradited to the United States in January 2017, the Department of Justice knew that a standard high-security facility would never suffice. They needed a place where his influence, his wealth, and his history of engineering tunnels would be rendered useless. They sent him to the black hole of Range 13. Range 13 is the most restrictive unit within ADX Florence. It is a 4-cell wing where the inmates have no physical contact with the guards who deliver their meals. The doors are operated remotely from a central control hub. The cells are soundproof to prevent any form of communication between the occupants. In this concrete silence, Guzman is no longer a billionaire kingpin. He is registered number 8914-053. 1. He is serving a sentence of life plus 30 years. He spent 22 hours a day in a 7 by 12 foot cell where every piece of furniture, the bed, the stool, the desk, is made of poured, reinforced concrete. His world has been reduced to Merces-run educational channels on a polished steel television and the 4-inch wide slit of sky that serves as his only window. The man who once oversaw a transnational empire is now unable to even choose when the lights in his room are dimmed. This is the end of the line for the great kidnappers of the cartel world. By placing leaders like Guzman or Larry Hoover, the founder of Chicago's gangster disciples, in the supermax, the government aims to decapitate their organizations. Without the ability to send a message or issue an order, their influence dies within the concrete walls. But as we look at the absolute constraint of Florence, we must also confront the times when the system remained blind until it was too late. This brings us to a case that serves as the most haunting systemic failure in modern forensic history, the story of Philip Garrido and Jaycee Lee Dugard. In June 1991, an 11-year-old girl named Jaycee Lee Dugard was snatched from a street in South Lake Tahoe, California, while walking to her school bus stop. For 18 years, her family and the authorities searched for her, believing she was a ghost. The reality was far more disturbing. Jaycee was being held captive just a few miles away in the backyard of a home in Antioch, California. Her abductor, Philip Garrido, had built a backyard empire of sheds, tents, and soundproofed enclosures hidden behind a high wooden fence. The forensic explosion in this case came not from a high-tech lab, but from the realization of how many times the system had let Jaycee down. Philip Garrido was a federal parolee at the time of the kidnapping. He had been convicted in 1976 for a different abduction and rape and was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison. In 1988, after serving only 10.5 years of that 50-year sentence, Garrido was granted parole. The decision was made after a 35-minute interview where parole officials decided he was no longer a threat. For the next 18 years, while he held Jaycee Dugard in his backyard and fathered 2 children with her, parole officers and local police visited his home. They walked past the fence. They spoke to him on his porch. Yet, they never looked in the sheds. They never questioned the presence of a young woman and 2 children who did not exist on any public record. Garrido was finally unmasked in August 2009 after a suspicious encounter on the University of California, Berkeley campus. His monstrous history was revealed, and in June 2011, he was sentenced to 431 years to life. Today, Philip Garrido is not in ADX Florence. He is housed at California State Prison, Corcoran, in the Protective Housing Unit. This is a specialized unit for high-profile inmates whose crimes, specifically those against children, make them immediate targets for violence in the general population. It is the same unit that once held Charles Manson. The story of Jaycee Dugard is a mirror to the story of Elizabeth Smart. In both cases, the monster was a man who had already been in the system's grasp. The systemic blindness of the 1980s and 1990s allowed these men to return to the streets, whereas the forensic certainty of the 2000s eventually put them back in boxes made of stone. It is difficult to reconcile the high-tech surveillance of El Chapo in Florence with the fact that Philip Garrido lived for 18 years under the nose of his parole officers. If you feel that the justice system needs more than just concrete walls, that it needs better oversight to prevent these backyard empires, let me know in the comments. What's the weather like today where you are? As we think about Jaycee Dugard, who lived in a shed for 18 years, the simple act of feeling the wind or the rain on your face takes on a new meaning. Tell me, what time is it there as we enter the final act of this investigation? You are watching Crime Cortex. We are about to move into our final section, the silence that follows the sentence. We will look at the psychological collapse of the monsters and the final forensic legacy of these explosive cases. Hit that like button if you are still with us. We are closing the book on the architecture of absolute constraint. Dash the final silence, outro and wrap up. What happens to a person when the world stops looking, when the headlines fade, when the cameras are packed away, and the last of the legal appeals is exhausted? The monsters we have discussed today are left with a single unchanging reality. Inside the walls of ADX Florence, the narrative of the crime ends and the narrative of the consequence begins. It is a story told in the grey shadows of a 7 by 12-foot room. For some, the silence is more than the mind can handle. We have talked about the architecture of constraint as a triumph of security, but we must also look at it as a site of psychological collapse. In the 1980s, Knott was a man who struck terror across several states during a 9-day crime spree that involved multiple abductions and the death of a hostage. He was a man of action, a man of violence, but when he was sent to Florence, that violence had nowhere to go. Knott spent 11 years in solitary confinement. By 2013, the man who had once commanded fear was reduced to a shell. Fellow inmates reported seeing him stark raving mad, babbling incoherently at his steel door. He lived in a state of absolute filth, smearing his cell walls with feces and drinking the soapy grey water from the bottom of his shower. In September 2013, Robert Gerald Knott used a bedsheet to end his own life. His death was one of at least 7 suicides at the facility, a grim testament to what happens when the human persona is met with absolute unchanging isolation. Then there was Lawrence Claker. He had escaped from a jail in New Orleans and kidnapped a schoolteacher in Alabama before becoming a violent enforcer for the Aryan Brotherhood within the federal system. Like Knott, Claker found that in the Supermax there were no more people to dominate, no more systems to break. He took his own life in November 2002. These men were monsters in the eyes of the public, but in the eyes of the Bureau of Prisons, they were simply problems to be contained until they eventually neutralized themselves. The evolution of how we reach this final silence is perhaps the most fascinating part of our forensic journey today. When we look back at the 1980s and 90s, we see a justice system that relied on human memory and luck. In the Elizabeth Smart case, the monster was a street preacher who was allowed to walk away from a library encounter because a detective was deterred by a religious veil. It was an era of human error, where a lack of DNA and a reliance on hand-drawn sketches allowed abductions to stretch into months and years. But as we move into the 2020s, the game has changed. The explosive investigations of today are built on biometric certainty. The men who called themselves the Beatles in Syria believed they were invisible behind their masks. They believed that in the chaos of a collapsing war zone, they could simply blend into the crowd. They did not realize that their fingerprints were already waiting for them in a global database. They did not realize that a digital photograph taken in a desert camp could be cross-referenced with intelligence files in London and Washington in a matter of seconds. The hunt for the monsters has become a mathematical pursuit. The digital breadcrumbs of safe meal accounts and the high-tech eavesdropping that tracked the Wolverine watchman in Michigan ensure that the black hole of ADX Florence is more crowded than ever. Diane Foley, the mother of James, has been a leading advocate for hostage policy reform since her son was killed in Syria. She has said that while the life sentences for Elsheikh and Alexanda Kotey are a huge victory, the true value of the Supermax is the message it sends. It is a message of deterrence. It tells anyone who would dare to kidnap, torture, or kill an American citizen that the United States will find you, no matter where you hide or how long it takes. In the end, the architecture of absolute constraint is designed to turn the monster back into a memory. By stripping away their ability to communicate, to influence, or even to see the horizon, the system attempts to erase the threat they pose to society. In the concrete pits and the dog runs of Florence, the explosive, true crime story reaches its final static chapter. As we close the book on this investigation, what a return to that initial question. What is the weather like as we reach the end of our story? If the sun is shining where you are, take a moment to appreciate the warmth. Think about the men in the H Unit and Range 13 who will live out the rest of their days in a room where the only view of the world is a 4-inch by 4-foot sliver of the sky. Does the scale of their isolation fit the scale of their crimes? Thank you for spending this hour with us on Crime Cortex. This has been a deep track into the mechanics of absolute justice. If you have a case you want us to investigate, one where the forensics changed the game, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of your suggestions. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who values real, verified true crime storytelling. And if you have not joined our community yet, hit that subscribe button. We are already deep into the research for next week's investigations into the forensic failures of the 1970s. You do not want to miss it. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember, the long arm of justice is now equipped with digital eyes. This is Crime Cortex, signing off.